Hello, and welcome back to our Intro to Music Theory series. In this video, we'll be expanding on chords by talking about seventh chords, as well as altered chords and inversions. If you like what you learned, be sure to leave a like and comment below with your favorite chord. Also, be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to be alerted when more videos drop. With all that out of the way, let's dive in. So in our last video on triads, we learned how to build and label intervals and triads, but chords aren't just limited to 3 notes. They can have as few as 2, or as many as you want. So we can do all sorts of things in order to spice up these chords and alter their flavor. Whether it's adding extra notes, switching the order of the notes around, or adding some movement, we'll learn all about the different spices in our theory pantry that would make Gordon Ramsay proud of our tasty music. First, we'll talk about chord inversions. So here we have our normal D minor triad in root position. This is called root position because D is the first note on the bottom of the triad. But maybe we want the sound of the D minor chord, but just a little bit higher. So we can keep the same 3 notes that make up our D minor triad, but we'll move this D up on top of the chord. So now our triad will be spelled F-A-D. It's still technically a D minor chord, but we inverted it by taking the bottom note and putting it on top of the triad. Without the root note of the chord on the bottom, it's no longer in root position. Now this D minor chord is in its first inversion. So if we're in the key of D minor, since this is a D minor chord, it's a minor 1 chord. If we wanted to write out the symbol for this chord, we would write out the capital D with the lowercase m to signify it being minor. And then since it's in first inversion, we'll add a little 6 up here in the corner after the chord. The little 6 indicates it's in a first inversion. We use a 6 here because the root note is now 6 notes away from the new bottom note. But say now we wanted that same D minor chord, but it's just not high enough. We have to move it up a little bit higher to fit the flavor of the music just a little better. We can invert it once more, moving the F that's now on the bottom of the chord to the top of the D, leaving A as our new bottom note. Now our chord is spelled A-D-F, and this is called the second inversion. To indicate that second inversion, we would write this chord as D minor with a little 6 and now a little 4 under that 6. Looking kind of like a fraction just without the line between them. The 6 lets us know that the top note is 6 notes away from the bottom note, and the middle note is 4 notes away from the bottom note. If we want to write these for Roman numerals, we will follow the same 6 and 6-4 signage that we did for the first and second inversions. This all stems from something called figured bass, but that's not a musical system we're really going to be talking about over this series, since it's not really used much in today's music. So for our inversions, for now, we have 3 main positions: root position, first inversion, and second inversion. Root position is our normal triad snowman. First inversion takes the root note and moves it up an octave to now be on top of the chord, leaving the third of the triad as our bottom note. Second inversion moves that third interval in the triad up on top again, leaving the 5th note as the bottom of the triad. To signify first inversion in our chord symbols or with a Roman numeral, we will write a small 6 in the upper corner next to the note, and for second inversions, we will write a 6-4 over it like this. Really, inversions are just ways of shuffling around the notes to change the sound of them, or to have chords fit better in a performer's instrument. For example, when playing the piano, the less fingers you move, the easier a piece typically is to play. So if I were playing the chords A minor to C major, I can actually play the 2 chords by moving just 1 finger. I can start on the root position A minor and then move just my thumb down 1 note to G, and now I'm playing a C major chord in its second inversion. This is how inversions can be super helpful when writing or performing music. Well, we've talked about triads at length now, so let's start adding some notes to our chords. We spell triads with 3 notes: the root, the third, and the 5th. Each are a skip apart from each other on the staff. But what happens if we throw 1 more note on top of the triad, a skip up from the 5th? That note interval would be the 7th, and the 7th note in any interval or scale can alter how a chord sounds dramatically. 7th chords, not to be confused with 7 chords, which is a chord built off the root of the 7th note of the scale, are chords that contain the 7th note above the root of the chord. Let's go back to the best and easiest key for demonstrations, C major. The 7th above C is B, so if we write out a C7 chord, it would be spelled C, E, G, and then a skip above G is B. We make our triad like before, then just skip up one more note and make our musical snowman just one block taller. Clearly, these snowmen are not from Texas. Seventh chords come in a few different flavors, mainly major, minor, diminished, and half diminished. Now let's take a look at a major seventh chord. Since our root note is C, this B would be a major seventh above C since B is in the key signature of C major. So this C major triad would be named C major 7, and the chord symbol would be a capital C with a capital M and a 7 after it. Sometimes in music charts, people will also put a triangle between the C and the 7 to indicate that this is a major triad with a major 7th interval on top. This can actually get a little confusing because the major in C major 7 is referring to the 7th interval. Like we talked about in the last video, if a chord name is just the letter of the root note, it's assumed to be a major chord. So we already know that the triad is major by the capital C, so we add a capital M, or the triangle after it, before the 7 in order to indicate that that is a major 7th on that chord as well. We can also have a C major triad with a minor 7th. For this, first we'll build our C major triad and then add that minor 7th interval above the root note of C, which in this case will be B flat. So our C major minor 7 chord is spelled C, E, G, and B flat. This chord is very commonly associated with jazz music or the blues. To write out the symbol for this, we'll have a capital C for the major triad, and then next to it we'll write a 7 by itself, and the same for the Roman numeral. When you see a 7 by itself, it is assumed that that is saying it is a minor 7th chord. And this is because we use minor 7ths a lot more than major 7ths, and musicians can be lazy and would rather just put the 7 by itself to indicate minor, instead of having to write it every single time. So with our 7th chords, we already have 4 options to choose from. We have the major chord with a major 7th, major chord with a minor 7th, a minor chord with a major 7th, and a minor chord with a minor 7th. So let's go ahead and talk about diminished chords now. We know from the previous video that a diminished triad is a minor chord with the 5th of the chord lowered a half step as well. So let's pop that 7th on there now. If we lower that 7th a half step, that makes this a minor 7th above C, giving us the diminished triad of C, E flat, and G, with a minor 7th of B flat on top. So this is called a half diminished 7th chord, and to symbolize it, we'll use the same circle from our previous diminished chords, but we'll put a little line through it, like this. In order to make a fully diminished chord, we need to lower that 7th a half step one more time, taking the B flat down. Now technically, this would be an A, especially in terms of pitch, but since intervals are named for their letters and not their pitches, this note will still need to remain a B. So we'll add another flat sign to it, making it a B double flat. This is a fully diminished 7th chord now, spelled C, E flat, G flat, and B double flat. It would be written C dim 7, or C with the little circle next to it, and then a 7 after it. They can sound pretty crunchy and typically give the music a sense of suspense or anxiety. So there we have all our different flavors of 7 chord. We have a major 7, major minor 7, a minor major 7, a minor 7, a half diminished 7, and a full diminished 7. Earlier, we talked about inverting chords in order to shuffle the notes around, and 7th chords can be done like this as well. If you take that top note of the 7th and throw it on the bottom, that's called the 3rd inversion of a chord. They aren't very common because they can sound pretty crunchy, but you may sometimes run into them. The 7th chords can add a whole lot of depth to your music for sure, but beyond that, there are other ways to spice up your music as well. There are also 9, 11, and 13 chords as well, though you'll likely only see those if you're reading jazz music. In an octave, there are only 8 notes, so if you see a 9, 11, or 13, they will be higher than the octave. These numbers are just telling you how many notes above the root note you'll be adding on to the chord. For example, if we see a C9 chord, we're playing a C triad with an added note 9 notes above C, which will be D, but an octave up. When we're reading these chords, they're inclusive of all the notes before them, so if we see a C9, we know that we'll be playing a C triad with C, E, and G, but also the 7th and the 9th notes above that C. So B and D are on this chord as well. A C11 chord will have C, E, and G, then B, D, and F. And a C13 chord will have C, E, G, B, D, F, and finally A. Now you can split these notes up in a chord, or leave some out in order to make it easier to play or read. Typically, we'll want to leave the third in the chord because that gives us the quality of the chord, but a lot of people may leave the fifth out if they need to strike a note, because it's the same note whether it's a major or a minor chord, so it's not super necessary to the music. You may also see flats and sharps in the chord symbols, like this C#9 chord. All that means is that we're playing a C9 chord with that ninth note, the D, raised a half step to D sharp, giving us a chord spelled C, E, G, B, and D sharp. Sharp 9 and flat 5 chords are pretty common to see when looking at chord charts. So let's go ahead and give it a try spelling out some of these chords here. Here we have a G7 chord, so let's figure out how to write that. Our G major triad is going to be G, B, and D, and then we need a seventh, and the 7 notes above G is F. Because that 7 is by itself, that lets us know that it's a minor 7th, which is F natural, giving us G, B, D, and F to make a G7 chord. Now here is a chord spelled F, A flat, C flat, and E double flat. I know it's mean, but you'll run across this in real music. So let's go ahead and try and find this chord's name. It has a root of F, and the C flat makes it a diminished triad. So now we have an E double flat on top, which means the 7th interval was lowered twice. So it's not a minor 7th, but a diminished 7, giving us an F diminished 7 chord. The biggest indicator of a diminished 7 chord is a double flat on top of the chord. So for this one, we have a D minor 9 chord. The D minor triad is spelled D, F, A. The 7th interval above D is C, and the 9th interval above D is E. So a D minor 9 chord is going to be spelled D, F, A, C, and E. So how about we try and find the name for this chord? It has a root of E, a G sharp, a B, a D sharp, an F sharp, and an A sharp. This A sharp is 11 notes above E, giving us an E sharp 11 chord. And finally, here we have an A flat 5 sharp 9 chord, because sometimes you'll see more than one modification on a chord. Let's start by stacking out all 5 notes that we need for this chord, starting with the A major triad. The A major triad is spelled A, C sharp, and E, and the 7th is G, and the 9th is B. So we have our snowman, but that flat 5 means that we have to lower the 5th a half step from E to E flat, and that sharp 9 means raising the B a half step from B to B sharp, giving us a chord spelled A, C sharp, E flat, G, and B sharp. Now this is a wild chord for sure, but just remember that you can make anything sound good as long as it's in musical context. A great job following along with that demonstration and making it to the end of another video. I hope you've learned something to help you spice up your theory kitchen today. If I've left something unanswered or you have any other questions, please leave them in the comment sections below. And as always, keep up that fight against awful music.